Welcome everyone to this special Road versus Rail event. I'm very excited to have you here with us today. We have lots of people from all over the UK and Australia, I've just seen. Just a quick introduction, my name is Brogan and I work with PTRC. We are a training company that's based in the UK. We specialize in the training of transport planners, engineers, designers, and placemakers. We're part of the Chartered Institute of Logistics and Transport, the membership organization for professionals leading the movement of goods and people. We're really looking forward to this event in collaboration with the Transport Planning Society today. So with that being said, I'll hand over to Stephen, who is the chair of the Transport Planning Society and also your chair for today's event. Thanks, Stephen.
Thank you, Brogan. And good afternoon, everyone. My name is Stephen Bennett, and I'm the chair of the Transport Planning Society. Thank you very much for taking the time to join us today. We have a great lineup of speakers, and I'm looking forward to hearing from them and having a chance to ask questions of the panel in the discussion. And we do have an opportunity to put your questions to them in the chat. So if you will post questions, we'll put them to our guests. As Brogan said, this event is jointly hosted by CLT UK and the Transport Planning Society and organised by PTRC Education and Research Services. So thank you to our friends at both organisations for supporting the event with us. And I'd like to give a brief introduction to the TPS and then I'll go on to introduce this particular event. So for those not familiar with the Society, we are the professional home for transport planners across the UK and Ireland. We have a range of membership options. You can join as a student for free or as an individual, and we also have stakeholder membership for both small and large firms. Our mission statement is to facilitate, develop and promote best practice and innovation in transport planning and provide a focus for dialogue between all those engaged in it, whatever the background. And why is this important? Well, transport planners have an absolutely crucial role in society in addressing the economic, environmental and social challenges that face us all now. In particular, the economic recovery from the pandemic, improving health and decarbonisation of the transport system, which is our topic for today. We need to plan and enable an efficient, integrated and healthy transport system, giving people easier access to essential services, to jobs, shops, leisure facilities and their friends and families, to provide a better quality of life for people and communities across the nations. And the Society undertakes a wide range of activities to achieve our aims. For example, we're developing and expanding our professional development offerings. So we now have a comprehensive range of training and qualifications from apprenticeships to the Early Career Professional Development Scheme, the PDS, to the newly chartered Transport Planning Professional Qualification. We've also been raising the profile of transport planning with government and stakeholders through our annual Transport Planning Day campaign and engaging on policy consultations and our own research. We have an annual bursary competition for early career professionals and a Transport Planner of the Year award. And we have regional groups across the UK who provide more locally focused events and activities. So do check out our website, tps.org.uk, to see the wide range of activities we're doing and how you can join up and get involved. So now for today's event. I'd imagine that most people on this call are aware that climate change is the most pressing challenge of our time, and taking action is a clear priority for the government. In June 2019, the UK government passed a law that requires it to achieve net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. And transport has a huge role to play in the economy reaching net zero. The scale of the challenge demands a step change in both the breadth and scale of ambition. And as a country, we have a duty to act quickly and decisively to reduce our emissions. The Department for Transport is currently developing a decarbonisation plan for the transport sector. This is to be published in the next few months, we hope. And in its scoping paper, the Decarbonising Transport Setting the Challenge, the DFT states that current plans and policies will not achieve the reduction in emissions that is needed if transport is to play its part in contributing to our legal obligation of net zero by 2050. And one particular cause for concern is the large-scale road building programme. Road transport is the largest emitter of greenhouse gases. Cars contributed 55% of domestic transport emissions in 2018. And rail, on the other hand, is a relatively low carbon form of transport and is one of the most efficient ways of moving high volumes of people into city centres and moving people over long distances. In 2018, greenhouse gas emissions from rail, both passenger and freight, made up just 1.4% of the UK's domestic transport emissions, while 10% of passenger miles travelled in Great Britain were by rail. And the railway is becoming less carbon intensive as new trains come into service and the railway uses greener electricity. So it sounds straightforward, but there are challenges. Road building is popular with the public and the government, and rail faces huge challenges in recovering from the devastating loss of passenger demand from the pandemic. But luckily, we have some excellent contributors today who will help us understand why it's been so difficult to reduce carbon in transport and what each industry, highways and railways, can do to help achieve the targets the UK government committed to. So the format of the event will be 2 presentations from our speakers, and then we have additional guests joining us for the panel discussion. In our second presentation, we have Stephen Hart from Network Rail to talk about the role of rail in supporting decarbonisation. But first up, we have Lynn Sloman and Lisa Hopkinson from Transport for Quality of Life, who will be speaking about their recent report on the carbon impact of the National Roads Programme. Lynn Sloman is Director of Transport for Quality of Life, which is a research consultancy and think tank which undertakes work that contributes to achieving an environmentally sustainable and socially equitable transport system. She's a commissioner for South East Wales Transport Commission, board member of Transport for London and trustee of the Foundation for Integrated Transport. And she's led a number of groundbreaking transport studies and evaluations of sustainable transport investment programmes for various organisations. And Lisa Hopkinson is an environmental researcher with over 30 years experience in Hong Kong and the UK in the charitable, educational and private sectors. She co-founded Civic Exchange, a public policy think tank in Hong Kong, and has also undertaken numerous environmental and transport-related research studies, projects and events. So suffice to say, they're both experts in the field and very much worth listening to on this topic. So we have 15 minutes for the presentation. Please do post any questions for the speakers in the chat, and we can put them to them later on in the discussion. But for now, I'm very pleased to welcome Lynn and Lisa. Over to you for the presentation.
Great, thank you very much indeed, Stephen. And Lisa's going to be sharing her screen, I hope. I'm going to just sort of talk through the first half of this and then hand over to Lisa for the second half. And as Stephen said, what we're going to be talking about is a study that we undertook last year to try to assess the potential carbon impacts of the National Roads Programme. And if you'd like to know more about it when we finish, then the report is on our website at transportforqualityoflife.com under Policy Research, Roads and Traffic. So if we could go to the next slide. First of all, just to start by thinking about why carbon emissions from the roads programme matter. So this graph shows carbon emissions from different sectors of the economy over the last period since 1990. And what you can see is that for most sectors of the economy, so energy supply, business, residential and so on, carbon emissions have gone down. In the case of energy supply, very significantly since 1990. But transport, which is the pink line, is the only sector of the economy where carbon emissions have gone up since 1990. And this graph shows total transport emissions, so it's international aviation and shipping, as well as domestic transport. And road transport accounts for 2/3 of total transport emissions at the moment. So it makes up a very significant proportion of that pink line. And if we go to the next slide, road transport emissions from the strategic road network make up about 40% of the total emissions from roads. And so if we're going to get transport emissions down, the emissions from traffic on the strategic road network, the SRN, are a key target for action. If we go to the next slide, this slide shows annual expenditure on the strategic road network, and it's all in 2018-19 prices. And what you can see is that in the period from about 2008 to 2012, before the first road investment strategy, RIS1, the average annual expenditure on the strategic road network was £1.6 billion in 2018-19 prices. For the next 5 years, that period from about 2013 to 2018, the period of the first road investment strategy, RIS1, annual expenditure on the strategic road network went up to a bit over £2 billion. And then in the 2018 budget, the Chancellor announced that the government would deliver the largest ever strategic road investment package for the period from 2020 to 25. And in budget 2020, it was confirmed that that would cost £27 billion over the next 5 years. And that means that over the RIS2 period, and this is the sort of dotted line, so it's forecast expenditure, average expenditure on the strategic road network will be £4.2 billion. And again, these are all in 2018-19 prices, so these are real increases in expenditure. And of that £4.2 billion a year, some of it's for maintenance, and about £2.8 billion a year is being spent on construction of new roads. And so it's clearly important to understand what the effect of that construction of new roads is likely to mean in terms of carbon emissions. So if we go to the next slide. Looks like we've got a problem getting to the next slide.
Sorry, it's not
responding.
It's not responding. Let me just.
That's okay.
It's frozen. Oh, there we go.
There we go.
Sorry.
So in the study that we undertook last year, we wanted to try to understand what all of the different impacts of the RIS2 might be on carbon emissions. And just breaking those down for a moment, the first effect, of course, is that when you decide to build a road, you need to clear the land. And so trees are felled and carbon sinks are lost. And then when the road is being built, clearly building roads involves quite a lot of use of some very carbon intensive materials. And so there's a significant amount of embodied carbon in the steel and the concrete and the asphalt that is used to build the road. Once a road's completed, typically average speeds on the road will increase. And if average speeds go up from 60 miles an hour to 70 miles an hour, that increases carbon emissions by about 13%. And finally, over time, as we increase road capacity and that unlocks land for development and we get more car-dependent development, we see induced traffic. And again, that's a source of further carbon. And we broke this down and tried to look at the construction impacts, that's both land clearance and embodied carbon, and then the impacts of high speeds, and then the impacts of induced traffic. If we go to the next slide, we'll just talk a little bit about the construction impact. Looks like Lisa's got a very sticky.
I'm sorry, I'm having trouble moving it.
It doesn't want to change, does it?
No. Apologies.
There we go.
There we go.
Okay, I'm going to go back.
It looks like we've gone into.
Yeah. There you go.
Lovely. Great. Thanks, Lisa. So looking first of all at construction impacts. So Highways England predicts CO2 emissions from construction. And at the time that we did the study, there were 11 publicly available appraisals of planned road schemes with a total cost, combined cost of just over £5 billion, which reported the CO2 emissions that were anticipated from construction. And average emissions from construction worked out at around about 450 tonnes of CO2 per £1 million spent, with a range, quite a large range, from 60 to 730 tonnes per £1 million. Now, if we assume that those 11 schemes are broadly representative of the 50 or so schemes that will be built through RIS2, then RIS2 schemes would be expected to generate about 6 megatons of CO2 purely from the construction impacts. And if you go to the next slide, next we looked at what the effect of those new schemes might be in terms of increased vehicle speeds. And obviously those roads haven't been built yet, and so we can't look at how speeds have actually changed. But Highways England undertakes very thorough evaluation of the roads that it has built through so-called post-opening project evaluations. And those POPs report the change in carbon emissions in the scheme opening year. So this is an evaluation after the road has been completed, looking back at what happened in the scheme opening year. And changes are a result of increases in speed, changes in road length, changes in the traffic mix, changes in traffic flow. And for the 80 schemes that Highways England has built since 2002, and for which a post-opening project evaluation is available, we've got that data on the change in CO2 emissions in that scheme opening year due to speed and those other effects. Now, obviously, if you were to build those roads now, even if speeds went up by the same amount as they did when the road was built in 2002, the effect in terms of carbon emissions might be less because our vehicles now are on average somewhat more fuel efficient than they were in, say, 2002. And so in trying to use that database to predict future impacts of road schemes, we had to factor down to allow for the increase in vehicle efficiencies. If you do that, then the average carbon emissions per £1 million works out at about 49 tonnes of CO2. And 80% of the schemes that we looked at had an additional increase in emissions of between 0 and 100 tonnes of CO2 per £1 million spent. So we were interested in understanding what the effect of that might be over time. Clearly, if speeds go up, you might expect that to happen not just in the opening year, the scheme opening year, but in subsequent years. And we looked at the period between now and 2032. We assumed that emissions would continue to fall as vehicle efficiencies improve. If you do that, then the cumulative effect for the whole of the RIS2 programme works out as about 6 to 6.6 megatons of CO2 between now and 2032. So that's speed. If we go on to look now at induced traffic impacts, so as well as the post-opening project evaluations looking at the increase in carbon emissions in the scheme opening year, they also report the total CO2 emissions in the scheme opening year. And that information was available from 63 of Highways England's evaluations. So again, what we did was to factor that to 2018 vehicle efficiencies. And that gives a figure for the average total CO2 emissions from a road scheme per £1 million spent, with quite a large range from some schemes which are really relatively small flow and therefore relatively low carbon emissions to some very big schemes with very high carbon emissions. Now, we assumed that between now and 2032, there would be an effect due to induced traffic, which would average about 2% per year. And that's based on analysis of traffic growth relative to background trend for 13 road schemes that we looked at in a previous study. But clearly, the increase in carbon emissions due to induced traffic is again going to be offset to a degree by improving vehicle efficiencies. And if you mash that all together and do the sums, the cumulative added emissions over the next 12 years from induced traffic on RIS2 schemes would be about 7 to 8 megatons of CO2. And so putting that all together, if we go to the next slide, we can look at the total, and we'll get there in a moment. But just while Lisa's trying to persuade her computer to, there we go, nope, that's gone the wrong way. The total increase in emissions from construction is about 6 megatons of CO2, from higher speeds is about 6 megatons of CO2, and from induced traffic is about 7 to 8 megatons of CO2. And if you add that all together, yes, brilliant. Then the total increase in CO2 emissions from RIS2 schemes over the next 12 years would be of the order of 19 to 20 to 21 megatons of CO2. And just as a cross-check of those findings, since we completed our study, Highways England has published appraisal summary tables for 40 of the planned RIS2 schemes, and that's about 80% of the total programme. And thanks, Lisa, that's great. And the appraisal summary tables for those 40 RIS2 schemes include estimates of what the likely cumulative CO2 emissions from those schemes will be over their 60-year design life drawn from environmental assessments. And if you simply add together those cumulative CO2 emissions for the 40 schemes, so for 80% of the programme over the 60-year design life of those schemes, the total comes to 26 megatons of CO2. And obviously that is that is over a 60-year period rather than over the 12-year period that we looked at. But clearly we expect most of those emissions to be in that earlier period rather than later on when there's quite a lot of electrification. DFT has argued that figure of 26 megatons probably overstates the true impact because environmental assessments don't take full account of likely increases in average vehicle efficiency. And so maybe that 26 is a slightly high estimate, and perhaps it should be a little bit lower, perhaps a bit closer to our 20 megatons. But whether it's 20 or 26 megatons of CO2 or somewhere in that order, that seems to be the sort of number that's emerging as the potential extra carbon that's going to be emitted as a result of Hs2 schemes. Now, the question that then arises, is 20 or 26 megatons of CO2 a large amount or a small amount? And here I'm going to hand over to Lisa just to talk a little bit about how significant that might be.
Thank you very much, Lynn. Apologies for the technical problems. It always works in the run through. So, how significant is the 20 million tonnes that we've estimated from the SRN? The problem is that the Government Department and Highways England, they have no carbon budget or plan to show how they'll stay within the budget. We haven't seen the Decarbonising Transport Plan yet. So this means there's nothing against which those emissions can be judged. And to address this, we suggest there should be a binding carbon budget for the transport sector as a whole, as well as for the SRN. So what we did in our paper is we developed a carbon budget for the SRN, and we adopted the Tyndall Centre carbon budgets, which have been developed for all local authorities in England. And these typically require reductions of 10 to 16% year on year. So what we did is we took the SRN emissions, we took a 13% annual reduction, and we estimated a cumulative carbon budget over the next 12 years for the SRN of 214 million tonnes. So that's up to the end of the fifth carbon budget period. And then we compared that to the forecast emissions from the SRN over the same period. And these were 381 million tonnes. That's based on the previous government's proposal for a 2040 phase out of petrol and diesel cars and vans. So as you can see, there's a difference there of 167 million tonnes, or about 44%, between what we estimate the budget should be and what the forecast emissions are. In other words, Hs2 will make emissions go up by 20 million tonnes over the next 12 years, when we need them to go down by 167 million tonnes instead. So since we produced our report, the Committee on Climate Change has produced their sixth carbon budget, including a net zero transport pathway, which you can see on the right, the purple line. Also the government has announced that it's bringing forward the ban on fossil fuel cars and vans from 2040 to 2030, with a phase out for hybrids by 2035. So this will certainly reduce emissions from road transport. However, it's worth noting that there's no allowance for the increases in emissions from road construction in the CCC's transport budget. The Committee on Climate Change's forecasts also depend heavily on the rapid uptake of electric vehicles. And if this doesn't happen as fast as forecast, then this is going to undermine our ability to reach net zero. This is already quite a challenge, and we're already, we're already set to miss the fifth carbon budget targets. So how to properly account for transport in carbon assessment. Previously, we've recommended a series of cascading transport budget. At a national level, we think there should be binding carbon budgets for all departments. So Department for Transport would have a budget for transport. They would then set carbon budgets at a sectoral level for Highways England, the rail sector, the aviation sector, and sub-regional transport bodies. And the sub-regional transport bodies in turn would set carbon budgets for local or transport authorities and combined authorities. And all of these carbon budgets will be binding, but DFT would have responsibilities to make sure that the overall transport budget is met. And as with financial budgets, Programmes and schemes should not go ahead unless they comply with those carbon budgets, and this includes the road strategy. So all future spending and plans should be compatible with carbon goals. A plan for binding departmental carbon budgets was actually published in 2008, but was then shelved. So we think it's time to resurrect and implement this plan. And to achieve carbon targets, we also need to reallocate spending from things that increase emissions to measures that reduce emissions. So we think we should be reallocating the road spending to sustainable travel. And with RIS2, roads spending on local and national roads is going to approach around 10 billion a year. By contrast, public spending on walking, cycling and local public transport is around 2.5 billion a year. And we also need a new method to appraise transport projects instead of the existing cost-benefit analysis approach with its built-in biases that favour road projects. So we need an appraisal process which prioritises carbon reduction and the cost effectiveness of reducing carbon. So this report by the Future Generations Commissioner for Wales on the right did just that, and this proposed instead of spending 1.4 billion on a 14-mile stretch of motorway of the M4 in Wales, which was hugely damaging and would have been, it was hugely controversial. This report set out ways that the Welsh Government could cut congestion more cheaply through alternative sustainable travel infrastructure, and also have better outcomes on other factors as well. So we need every major transport decision to take account of the carbon budget. And in doing so, we're going to create a much safer, fairer, cleaner, healthier, more efficient transport system in the process. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Lynn and Lisa. Very interesting piece of research, and I would recommend people to have a look at the report in detail. It's great. I found particularly the quotes from all the different appraisals of road schemes very interesting, and I think it's for finding that each one individually was not significant, but obviously in aggregate they have a big impact. And I think understanding the carbon budgets, local carbon budgets and carbon budgets by sector is going to be really important. Excuse me, really important for transport planners to get to grips with in the future. So we'll move on swiftly. Thank you very much. And we'll move on to Stephen Hart. He's lead strategic planner from Network Rail. And Stephen's going to talk about the role of rail in supporting decarbonisation of the UK economy and what rail is doing to achieve the legislative decarbonisation targets. Stephen joined Network Rail in 2013 following the completion of a master's degree in programme project management at Warwick University. After time spent in infrastructure projects, developing and delivering a number of major infrastructure enhancements, he is now lead strategic planner for freight and national passenger operators within Network Rail's system operator function. Stephen has recently led the successful completion of the Traction Decarbonisation Network Strategy. So welcome, Stephen. You've got 15 minutes or so. Just a reminder to people to keep posting questions. We've had a few good questions come in already. And over to you, Stephen.
Thanks, Stephen. That's great. Can you hear me and see me okay, and see the slides?
Yep, looks good.
Fantastic. So yes, thanks, Stephen, and thanks for inviting me along today to talk about the rail aspects of decarbonisation. As Stephen said in the introduction there, I work in Network Rail's system operator freight and national passenger operations team. So me and my team are principally responsible for developing strategies within the rail sector for rail freight, but we also pick up strategic items of strategic importance on a rail network wide level as well. And my role is focused on developing the Traction Decarbonisation Network Strategy, which we'll talk a little bit more about in my presentation, amongst other things. Firstly, I just thought I'd start just by providing a little bit of context around the railway itself. So the railway is owned and managed by Infrastructure Owner Network Rail, so the organisation I work for. We ultimately provide all of the fixed assets and signallers to operate the railway, and we manage the 20 largest stations in the UK ourselves as well. But all of the kind of railway stations and the actual train trains that operate over the network are managed and run by passenger operators, and freight trains are run by freight operating companies. So they're private organisations who operate or currently contracts that are specified by government in the case of passenger operations, and then freight operations is a completely private entity where the freight operators are responsible for kind of finding customers and operating services in conjunction with the network. Trains on our network in Great Britain currently are essentially powered by one of two traction systems. So they use one of two systems to effectively run diesel and the combustion of diesel in diesel combustion engines, and electricity that's mostly provided from 25,000 volt overhead lines, but there is a number of areas of the network as well that operate using a 750 volt DC third rail system, very kind of similar in nature to London Underground and how the London there's a real mix of different traction systems within the passenger market, and there is a good balance between kind of electric trains and diesel trains for passenger operations, with the greater majority of passenger services operated by electric than diesel. But unfortunately for freight, it's the opposite way around, and that's largely because freight operates over significant distances and requires kind of end-to-end electrification to be able to operate freight electrically, and a number of the routes that freight take on aren't currently electrified, and as a result most freight in the UK operates using diesel trains. So we've heard about roads, and we've heard about some of the role that roads has to play out. Obviously, rail as part of surface transport has an emissions footprint as well. As Stephen alluded to in his introduction, rail is a very green mode of transport. We contribute less than 1% of the overall UK greenhouse gas emissions, and from a transport perspective, we contribute around 2% of all transport emissions in the UK. Within rail, emissions come from two main areas really: the trains themselves and the operation of trains on the network, and the electricity that we use to kind of power the various systems that operate on the network, as well as the kind of power to the various kind of offices and depots and stuff that we have across the entire country, to kind of continually operate and upkeep and maintain the railway. So we normally refer to those as non-traction emissions. So traction is the emissions that comes from trains, and non-traction is basically everything else. So non-traction emissions are principally from electricity, as I touched on, from such things as kind of power to signals, the traffic lights on the railway, and kind of points, as well as stations and offices. And we obviously have a significant amount of workforce on a network-wide level as well that is required to operate and maintain and upkeep the railway. And to do that, we use a vast array of kind of road vehicles as well to be able to get around the network. And there is an amount of our emissions comes from kind of the road fleet that we use to support that. Just a quick note from a traction perspective, the electricity that Network Rail provides is for traction is bought through a power purchase agreement where effectively it's offset against units of nuclear energy, so we can sort of draw out the fact that the big culprit of diesel, the big culprit of CO2 emissions in rail traction comes from kind of diesel trains, and we need to focus on getting rid of diesel trains basically. Just a quick point around kind of the wider topic, and a little bit some thoughts around kind of the road and rail conversation, and I'm sure there'll be lots of interesting questions around this as we go forward for the rest of the session. But rail is going to have a huge role to play in supporting transport decarbonisation. One train can remove a lot of cars and a lot of vans and a lot of HGVs off the road, and that as a result will not only reduce emissions will more than anything reduce emissions from kind of the wider transport sector, as we sort of move things around in a more efficient way. As well as that, removing those vehicles brings about a lot of other benefits as well, such as improvements in road safety, reductions in congestion, and decrease in road maintenance. And as we've seen around some of the numbers that have been presented there, some of those factors are really important in further reducing emissions, as well as improving general kind of the general role of the roads in the UK network. I think one thing I really want to stress, and one slight point of contention about the title of this session, I think it's really important from certainly from my perspective and the conversation that we have. I very much don't see this as a road versus rail thing. Road has a massive role to play in transport and logistics. Rail has a massive role to play in transport and logistics. It's about striking that balance between road and rail and making sure that we're using the kind of right modes of transport for the right movements of people and goods in the various different situations that they do. And I'm sure we'll explore that further with questions later. What I want to spend the rest of the session on is just talking a little bit more around some of the stuff that we're doing. So Network Rail is working really closely in collaboration with the wider industry, the wider rail industry, to challenge and kind of remove both direct and indirect emissions from both traction and non-traction aspects, including removing of diesel trains, as we've touched on, as well as making sure that our electricity and materials are sourced from responsibly sourced and provide suitable considerations around emissions from that. So traction and trains. As Stephen alluded to in my introduction, I've recently concluded a piece of work called the Traction Decarbonisation Network Strategy, which is a piece of work that's being done on behalf of the wider rail industry to determine how we can remove diesel trains from the network and replace them with electric, battery and hydrogen trains. To be able to reduce the emissions from rail traction. As you can see on the chart on the right hand side there, the various different technologies on offer have different capabilities. It's important to stress that given the technological limitations of both battery and hydrogen, neither technology is suitable for train operation over 100 miles an hour or for freight operations, which requires principally because high speeds require high power and freight requires high power because of the kind of thousands of tons of goods that the freight train carries behind it. So it requires a lot of energy to be able to do that. Obviously, hydrogen and battery is an emerging technology in most fields, and things may change as we go forward into the future, but both battery and hydrogen would have to significantly improve many times over if they were to be able to accommodate kind of operations that we have today. And as a result, electrification is the only solution for kind of services in the both the short, medium and likely long term, for long distance high speed operations and for freight. On the rail network, from an electrification perspective, rather selfishly, we measure the railway in what are called single track kilometres. So kind of 1 kilometre of 2-track railways is 2 single track kilometres basically. On the entire network, the unelectrified network, so the bit where we don't have electrification at the minute, is around about 15,500 single track kilometres. And the work we've done as part of Traction Decarb Network Strategy has identified that the vast majority of that requires electrification, principally for the operation of long distance high speed services and freight, but also for kind of areas where there's electrification offers a lot of benefits in terms of improved acceleration and stuff for high intensity routes where there's lots of trains run. There will definitely be a role for battery and hydrogen. We've identified a number of areas of the network, principally on the extremities, where battery and hydrogen would be a more kind of optimum technology to deploy, and we need to continue to work to deliver those trains as they begin to emerge, and we need to begin to get proof of concept vehicles that we have into operational service in those areas. In terms of non-traction decarbonisation, Network Rail also recently published its environmental sustainability strategy, which is outlining the work that we're doing to reduce our non-traction emissions as well as our focus on adaptation to climate change, biodiversity and introduction of the circular economy. Our commitments on non-traction aspects of our operations principally focusing around 4 key areas: making sure that we're making best whole life carbon assessments and decisions for our infrastructure project, and we're making sure that those decisions are being made and embedded as part of the decision-making process as we design, develop and deliver those projects. Making sure that we're reducing emissions through our supply chain by making sure that carbon usage and carbon intensity plays a principal part of our procurement processes, and making sure that we're procuring on a best for carbon basis, not just a best for cost basis. As I touched on earlier on, we have a lot of cars, vans, wagons, various different modes of transport that we use for our road fleet to support, upkeep, maintain and operate the network. As well as various other different things, and we're currently in the process of transitioning our fleet to low emissions vehicles through the provision of various charging points, and we're planning on having a fully ultra low emissions vehicle fleet by 2035. As well as that, we're beginning to transition to 100% renewable energy for our non-traction, as well as exploring generation of generating our own renewable energy through solar panels and various different other means on our own land, so that we can feed and provide power for the various different aspects of our operations on the network. I just want to spend a moment just to kind of dwell on something around climate resilience as well. This isn't specifically kind of a key thing from kind of a carbon emissions perspective, but certainly the rail network and the weather and climate, the changes that have been brought around by wider global warming is having a profound impact on the rail network in the UK, and we're doing a lot of work currently to kind of mitigate that and work to be able to make our network more resilient to the changes in climate, whether that be through increases in flooding or tree fall or kind of rail stress through high temperatures, or major events such as the one that you can see in the background there on Dawlish down in the southwest. We've had weather resilience and climate adaptation strategies in place in our business since 2017, and we're beginning to make progress based on those, and they're continually renewed and updated. The key thing around those plans is to make sure that we're providing and maintaining levels of operational resilience and performance for services for both passengers and freight, even in extreme weather. So essentially, when the weather's bad or there's a major issue, the railway doesn't stop running. We're obviously working hard to understand and develop and deliver schemes that will support that and allow us to deliver that successfully. What we're essentially doing as well is very much moving away from replacing assets in key areas on a like-for-like basis, and instead we're making sure that we're providing and replacing things on a like-for-better basis in order to be able to deal with not just today's climate, but also the climate of the future. Obviously, and most notably in the news, there was a recent event in Scotland which just shows the tragic implications of kind of what changes in climate can do, where one of our embankments failed due to extremely heavy rainfall in Scotland, and it caused a major derailment where there were 3 fatalities. That's really hard, and it's really a really terrible incident that's happened there. But one thing that is clear is we need to continue to work and make sure that our asset renewals and our asset replacements consider kind of the future weather projections that are going to hit the network, and make sure that we map those and are aware of those, and they're active work streams that are underway within Network Rail to deal with that. I hope that's given you some good sort of flavour of the work that's going on in Network Rail and the wider rail industry at the minute, and I'm sure there'll be lots of interesting questions to address and answer as we go through. So I'll encourage you to drop those in the chat. I've seen the chat's got a bit mad, so I'm assuming there must be lots of questions coming through. And I'll pass you back over to Stephen, who's going to take us through the rest of the session.
Thanks very much, Stephen. Yeah, there's lots of great questions and chat going on, which we're monitoring, and hope to get to those questions to our panel members. Just a couple of observations. A really good point about resilience. I think we're actually a lot of it's not now about avoiding impacts, but actually being resilient to the impacts we're already seeing. And I thought it was very diplomatic about balancing road and rail. We wanted a debate, a bit of confrontation, but you're right, it is a balance. So we'll go to the panel discussion now. Everyone's appeared. As we say, we've got some good questions coming in, but I just want to introduce a couple of new members to the panel that have joined us. So we've got Ivan Lefebvre, from Head of Environment at Highways England, and Julian Worth, Chair of the CILT UK Rail Freight Group. Ivan is a chartered landscape architect and leads on environmental standards for Highways England, supporting development of strategy in response to government's environmental policy objectives, including climate change, mitigation and adaptation, and wider areas of environmental performance, such as reversing the decline in biodiversity, reducing noise, improving air quality, and protecting the quality of the natural and built environment. And Julian has spent 41 years, that's very impressive, Julian, 41 years in the rail freight industry, in a wide variety of roles, including Managing Director of Transrail Freight and Marketing Director of English, Welsh and Scottish Railway. He now works with a range of clients in the private sector and public sector, providing strategic advice on rail-based logistics. He also writes on rail freight matters and speaks at conferences in the UK and abroad. As I mentioned, he's chair of the CILT Rail Freight Forum, and is a member of the Freight and Logistics and Strategic Rail Policy Groups. So welcome to you both. And before we get into the panel discussion, I'd like to give you both an opportunity just to say a few words about today's subject of decarbonising the transport sector and reducing emissions by 2030. So Ivan, would you like to go first? Have a few minutes to just give your view.
Thank you, Stephen, and it's great to be here today contributing to this event, and good afternoon, everyone. Stephen's introduced who I am and what I do, but I'm currently working with a team within Highways England on a company net zero carbon strategy and plan. So you will all see more about that this coming spring, and that will of course sit alongside the government's own transport decarbonisation plan. And we know that the strategic road network is a significant source of carbon, both in its operation and in its management, and indeed in its construction. And our plan will be targeting all of those areas. Just to say a little bit more about Highways England, we manage England's strategic road network. That network is valued at about £128 billion. It is a key strategic national asset that sits alongside things like the NHS, the military, I might say vaccine factories, supporting national resilience and national security. And it is an integrated part of our national transport system. Alongside rail, alongside other forms of transport, public transport, alongside local roads. And actually these forms of transport are interdependent. I know that when we have an incident on the M6, then we're dependent on local roads in order to get people around on diversions. I know that when the rail network has an incident on the West Coast Main Line, they will be running rail replacement services on the M6. So we have to recognise that actually as a integrated transport system, we have to manage it in a way that recognises those interdependencies. And today is about carbon, of course, we have to invest in new technologies and new ways of doing things in order to achieve decarbonisation across those forms of transport. And that's the real challenge for us. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Ivan. And Julian, over to you. Freight is often an afterthought in transport discussions, and I think in the pandemic and with Brexit, people have got much greater awareness in terms of the general public of freight issues, logistics, supply chains, and so on. So what are your thoughts on transport decarbonisation and reducing emissions in this sector?
Thanks, Stephen. Yes, freight is very often the afterthought, but what we need to realise in this context is that heavy vehicles over long distances are about the most difficult aspect of transport to decarbonise. In fact, it's probably one of the most difficult aspects of any part of the UK economy to decarbonise. Rail is probably the only proven way of moving freight over long distances with net zero emissions. If we have renewable energy or nuclear energy, our emissions are close to zero from using freight and moving freight by electric overhead wires, or indeed third rail for that matter. However, we do need to recognise that the final legs of supply chains to the final destination will always be by road. We're not going to be taking rail to every house and every shop in the kingdom. So this is all about multimodal supply chain design and getting the best out of each mode. Now, the good news there is that the battery technology for medium weight lorries over medium distances is coming along very well indeed. There are already lots of smaller lorries doing urban distribution, and that will increase rapidly. What that means is that those final legs of the supply chain can be decarbonised using electric road vehicles, and rail can decarbonise the trunk haul by using the existing technology that we have. So it's a blend of the two modes to provide a multimodal supply chain, which will allow us to decarbonise the whole supply chain from origin to destination. Now, just a few points, if I may, on this. It's often said that rail is not suitable for moving many types of freight that are on the road. That is fundamentally untrue. There is virtually nothing that cannot be moved by rail cost effectively. So we already on a daily basis do lots of chilled food, frozen food. We do lots and lots of just-in-time deliveries. So it's simply not the case that rail is unable to match road on some of these key supply chain requirements. Just as a final point for me, by way of introduction, if you look at the Department for Transport road statistics, the HGV statistics, what you will find is that 45% of all HGV ton miles are generated by journeys over 200 kilometres. Those are distances that rail is already competing for on a daily basis with consumer goods, never mind bulk materials. If you add bulk materials into the mix, you will find about another 9%, 8 or 9% of HGV ton miles are generated by bulk materials over distances over about 100 kilometres, which again, we do on a daily basis. So put those together and there is a general picture of somewhere around half of all HGV ton miles are capable of being switched to rail trunking, interfacing with those battery road vehicles for regional and local logistics. Very happy to expand on that in questions if anyone would like me to. Thanks, Stephen.
Thanks very much, Julian. Thanks, you and Ivan, for your introductions. So now we can open up the panel discussion, and we're having loads of questions coming in, sort of trying to keep track of the chat and to pass those on. I think one place I'd like to start really is on pricing, and I think there's one element of the kind of investment in the different modes of transport, which Lynn and Lisa's presentation touched on, but perhaps we can come back to that. I think initially, perhaps on the sort of pricing for consumers of transport, and it's something that Transport Planning Society picked up in our State of the Nations report last year. We made a number of recommendations on transport planning, and one was about reviewing the sort of overall pricing and comparative pricing of different transport modes across the UK, and recognising that car travel has got a lot cheaper in real terms compared to public transport, which basically sends all the wrong pricing signals to people. So it's kind of not surprising that people aren't responding to mode shift in the way we need them to when transport is priced in that way. So I just want to get thoughts from the panel on sort of pricing for consumers of and there's in the chat a lot of this issue has come up in regard to sort of making public transport free. So in particular, is there a view on that? Anyone want to pick that up? Lynn?
Thanks, Stephen. Yeah, I mean, I think that this question of sort of pricing is absolutely critical. So one of the questions is around the sort of the rumours sort of pay per mile road pricing that Treasury has been looking at. And we see it as absolutely critical that we move towards what the work that Lisa and I have done on this, we've called it an eco levy, a sort of pay per mile eco levy on driving. because we're going to see otherwise the cost of motoring go down as people get electric cars. What that will effectively mean is that rich people who can afford to buy an electric car over the sort of late 2020s, early 2030s will find that their cost of motoring goes down very dramatically. They'll drive more as a result. We'll have more congestion, more air quality problems because of particulate pollution, because of damage from brake and tyre wear, which electric cars are just as bad at as conventional cars. And so the situation will get very much worse. And if we were to just have quite a modest pay per mile eco-levy on driving, and that money was recycled into improving public transport, providing high quality infrastructure for walking and cycling, we'd get a sort of virtuous circle. So I think we see this as, absolutely something where we need to turn things on their head so that it gets cheaper to use public transport, or maybe even free, as one of the questions picked up. And that's something that a lot of French cities are doing now. And it certainly shouldn't get cheaper to drive, and actually it should be getting slightly more expensive as we improve the alternatives.
Thank you, Lynn. Does anyone else from the panel want to come in on that? Julian, yeah.
Yes, thanks, Stephen. On the freight side, the picture is not dissimilar. Everything we do in freight is on a straight market commercial basis. We compete with throughout road haulage for every single ton we move. Now, there is obviously growing interest in sustainable transport, and a lot of companies have corporate sustainability policies, which would lead them to move towards rail and other low carbon modes. But virtually none of them are prepared to pay any more for that green transport. So it's all, we compete just on price, day in, day out, the whole way. Now, the key point there is that it's become harder for rail to compete because the fuel duty escalator, which was a key part of government policy and still is officially, has been suspended now for 15, 16 years. Had that not been the case, the cost of fuel would be about 25 to 30% higher than it currently is. And when you remember that the, fuel is about a third of a road haulier's cost. So in other words, a third of road haulage costs have been kept much lower than they would have done if that policy had been followed. Perfectly capable to reinstate that, of course, and it would be a key driver of modal shift towards a low carbon rail. And I should say that even with diesel locomotives, rail emits about 1/3 of the emissions that lorries do. So in terms of eking out our carbon budget, modal switch to rail now, even with a diesel railway, is very, very worthwhile doing, let alone moving to truly zero carbon haulage when we get electric down the road. So there's some pretty important issues there, I would suggest. One thing that could be done very, very straightforwardly by government would be to reintroduce fuel duty escalator. It is, of course, hugely politically sensitive. But one thing they might think about, of course, is to impose it on diesel only at this stage. So in other words, the vast majority of voters, motorists, would not be adversely affected, but it would encourage the move away from diesel cars, and also it would encourage modal shift to rail for freight as well. I understand a lot of people would like to see the escalator reinstated on petrol as well, and I wouldn't disagree with that myself. But if that were judged to be too politically sensitive, there's a halfway house which could achieve quite a lot simply by reinstating the fuel duty escalator on diesel with some sort of catch up for the years that we've missed. Thanks.
Thank you, Julian. Ivan, yeah, do you want to come in?
Yeah, I mean, I don't, it's not for England on pricing mechanisms for transport that may be a better sit with government. But what I would make the case is that actually the travelling public aren't wrong to want to travel. The ability to move around freely is a great contributor to public quality of life, and many people value that highly. So we need to find a way of enabling people to have high quality transport choice, to choose modes that best suit their needs, but without sort of attacking, that's possibly an overly strong word, but without adversely impacting on people who want to move, want to travel flexibly about the country.
Lisa, yeah, do you want to come back on that?
I wouldn't disagree with Ivan on that. We do want people to be able to sort of move around as they want. And the problem is they can't at the moment because they don't all have that choice. You know, bus services has been decimated and public transport is so much more expensive. So I think this comes back, you know, the pricing and the availability of alternatives is really important. And it's a question of how fair it is at the moment where, you know, people can't, you know, they have to take a taxi to get to the hospital because there isn't a bus service, or they can't afford to take the train because it's too expensive compared to driving. And I think, you know, the Treasury, you know, the government's got a lot of levers. You know, Julian mentioned fuel duty, also vehicle excise duty was a huge factor in driving the sale of, you know, bigger cars, more, you know, less fuel economic cars, which has driven up carbon from roads in recent years. So I think there's a lot of mechanisms we can use, but fundamentally we need to make the, you know, we have to, the carbon imperative is absolute. You know, we have to drive carbon emissions down. That's, you know, that's the bottom line. You know, we're undermining our planetary life support systems here. How best do we do that? You know, as Lynn said, you know, we think pricing is absolutely key. We have to reduce, you know, the types of traffic that cause pollution and carbon emissions, and we have to encourage the alternative so that people can move around.
Yeah.
Thanks, Lisa. And then sort of moving on to investment in different modes. So Lynn and Lisa, you were talking about sort of reallocating investment from the roads programme to more local road schemes or public transport active travel alternatives. And there's some questions in the chat about also the kind of the appraisal process and how we're actually assessing projects against carbon budgets, and the point I made earlier from your report about that's from the Transport Action Network saying, you know, that how do we move away from they call it ridiculous carbon test where road emissions are compared to the total UK budget. So I don't know if has the panel got thoughts on kind of how we change the overall appraisal investment approach to get sort of lower carbon outcomes. Julian, yeah.
Yeah, at the minute, the UK uses a carbon price in project evaluation of $25 a tonne. The IMF have just recommended that we should be using $75 per tonne. So that's a pretty key driver, actually, in terms of where you allocate your investment. And it's worth saying that in terms of decarbonising rail, we would be looking at, we've already got nigh on half the rail network is electrified already, sort of high 48%, about 48%. For freight, we need just another 700 miles electrified. Now, using Stephen's measure of single track kilometres, that translates to about 1,500 single track miles. 1,400 1,400 single track miles, and therefore about 2,000 single track kilometres, doing the maths. That would cost round about £2 billion. You know, it's about it's just under £1 million per single track kilometre at the moment, and it's coming down towards £750,000 of a million. So we would be looking at an investment of £1.5 to £2 billion, and that would allow us to electrify about 98% of freight. You know, it's very concentrated on key routes. So just electrifying those key routes would have a huge payback in terms of carbon emissions. And just one little stat, we're currently looking at Transpennine electrification, and just the container movements from the East Coast ports to the northwest and from Liverpool to Yorkshire. The scope for transferring to rail there would save 59 million HGV kilometres per annum. It's an awful lot of vehicles that you can take off the road with benefits for not only carbon but air quality as well, of course, because, you know, the M62, M60 go through urban areas. So there's huge scope here. We just need to drive the investments in the right way and reflect not only the wider societal issues but also the really specific cost of carbon issues. Thanks.
Thanks, Julian. Lisa.
Yeah, as I touched on in our presentation, you know, we think we need to move away completely from the sort of cost-benefit analysis approach for appraisal. And the you know, the Welsh Future Commissioner of Generations report and also the Mayor of London are using a multi-criteria analysis. So it doesn't depend on a monetary value. It is, you know, it makes clear what the implications of different, in terms of different criteria are of a scheme. So you can make a much more sort of rounded decision. But also, you know, the cost effectiveness of carbon reduction has got to, you know, drive it as well. And before we even get to assessing the carbon for an individual road, we need to take a step back and say, well, what is the problem that the road is supposed to solve? and what alternatives are there? You know, if it's congestion, what are the alternatives to solving congestion, or what are the, you know, what is an alternative to addressing a safety issue on a road, rather than just assuming, as is often the case, that the road is the only answer to that problem. So we need a you know, a completely different mindset to look at this.
Yeah, Ivan, thanks, Lisa. Ivan got a hand up.
Yeah, I mean, I don't disagree with any of the comments made at the moment. What I would say is that investment in roads is not done on a project by project. We've got a problem here, how do we solve it in investing in the road? It's the result of a long-term strategy that fundamentally begins at long-term route strategies and how those routes perform against government planning policy requirements. And indeed, investment in other modes of transport has to be part of the mix of how we solve transport problems around the country. For me, appraisal needs to be agnostic, it needs to be impartial. We need to both be confident in how we quantify carbon in appraisal and then how we monetize the numbers of carbon. But the key point is actually how you then make policy decisions based on the information you get from appraisal. And I totally agree that a roads-based solution is not always the right solution to a roads-based problem. And you know, that's a Highways England company position, and we would absolutely work with government and other transport providers and other forms of infrastructure around delivering multimodal solutions if that was the right solution.
Thanks, Ivan. Lynn, you've got a hand up.
Yeah, thanks, Stephen. Just to say that on appraisal, you know, a lot of people have a lot invested in our approach to appraisal because it's a sort of system that's sort of built up over decades, and it becomes very difficult to criticise it because in some ways that's sort of striking at the foundations of a whole sort of edifice. But the disproportionate value that is ascribed to quite small savings in drivers' time, multiplied many, many thousands of times over, has a very distorting effect on the appraisal process. And I think that if we were able to look again at drivers' time savings and say, really, is this so important that we save 30 seconds here and a minute there, and take that out of the appraisal system, perhaps, and as Lisa said, couple that with much more focus on option generation. You know, way back about a decade ago, we were talking a lot about the new approach to appraisal and about option generation as being a essential first part. But that, I think, you know, doesn't really happen in practice to the extent that it should be happening. And so we end up with a system that is generating what are not, which are answers which are not very sensible. And I think there maybe are some things that we could do around drivers' time savings and around option generation, which if we could take one out and put one in to the appraisal process, we'd get something which is just much, much more sensible. And as far as Highways England is concerned, I think in a way, you know, Lisa talked about carbon budgets for different parts of the transport, a transport carbon budget, and then that being devolved down to different sectors, to local authorities, to the railway sector and to Highways England. And I suppose what we'd see is in an ideal world, Highways England would have a carbon budget for the strategic road network. And Ivan's job will be looking at how to achieve that carbon budget through a combination of managing demand on the strategic road network, maybe through road pricing, and incentivising people to drive smaller vehicles rather than larger ones, and encouraging car sharing. And so there's a really important role for Highways England in all of this. It's just that it's maybe not the role that it's playing at the moment. I know that's difficult and limited by what government is directing Highways England to do, but we'd very much see Highways England as being a really important part of all of this, but just playing a different role.
Thanks, Lynn. I'd like to give Stephen a chance to come in here, and there's a couple of questions on rail and particularly the sort of pandemic response, and I think that sparked some of the free public transport chat that we had. But obviously we're in a really challenging position for rail now, wanting more people to use rail, but in a time where we've all been told not to, and passenger demand has gone right down. We've seen many more people working at home, and a lot of surveys saying more people are going to work at home in future, which kind of changes the whole thinking on rail investment in future and rail demand, making it much more uncertain. So I wonder, Stephen, if you've got any comments on that and how that sort of affects the decarbonisation thinking.
Yeah, I mean, certainly from that's not necessarily just a specifically a rail thing as well. I mean, with working from home and the various different things that have changed in society, it will inexplicably change the way we choose to travel completely, and travel in general will be very different to how it was a year ago. From a rail perspective, there is obviously been a significant reduction in passenger numbers. At one point, we were down to around about 5% of our usual passenger numbers, and that subsequently grew as restrictions were eased a bit. But it's headed back down that way again now. The current position's in. They're obviously the passenger operations are obviously being carefully monitored and carefully controlled through the work that we're doing with train operating colleagues and work with the department. Very much from I think the key thing from a passenger COVID perspective is people will need certainty and will need assurance that the rail network is safe, and there is a lot of good work being done by the operators and organisations such as RSSB and stuff to provide good demonstrable evidence that that's the case. And I am almost certain that there will need to be some sort of incentivization to encourage people back onto rail and public transport, something akin to eat out to help out, but on in transport.
I like it.
I think the key thing is, and whilst the markets for rail would change, we've had there's a number of long-term forecasting work currently underway across the rail industry for passengers, and passenger numbers are obviously forecast to grow from where they are, obviously, but there's a likely kind of return to passenger volumes at some point within the next kind of 3 or 4 years, probably. It's very likely, though, that the markets will be very different, and we need to make sure that we're kind of adapting and providing the right sort of services for the market at the time, with things like the leisure market, and as people prefer to kind of do staycations and stuff like that, the long distance high speed market for kind of pleasure and leisure purposes is likely to kind of be one that potentially grows from pre-COVID levels. The one thing that I would say, though, is, and Julian, I'm sure will jump in as well, rail freight has remained strong and very buoyant throughout the pandemic, really. Rail freight is now up to around about 98% of pre-COVID levels, and is progressively growing, and in fact, as a result of COVID, there's been a number of new flows emerged for various different commodity types, and it's an area where there's a lot of key focus at the minute. One of the key areas of focus really has been understanding understanding how we can use the rail network more for freight, especially as there's less passenger trains operating currently, how we can run heavier, longer freight trains as they don't need to fit as well between kind of passenger services, and also where there's been reductions in passenger services, increasing the number of freight trains that we run from the likes of Southampton, Felix to all the other major ports that we run from. So there's lots of good opportunity there. Rail is going to play an absolute key part in the recovery from COVID, and has played a massive part in not just supporting key workers as they've transported, but in keeping the country going and keeping the country running. And I think as somebody in the freight sector says, there's nothing like a good crisis to a toilet roll crisis to realise just how important rail freight is. So.
Thanks, Stephen. Julian, do you want to come in?
Yeah, thanks, Stephen. Just to add very much to what Steve was saying there, rail freight never dipped below about 40%, even at the depths of the first lockdown. And just before Christmas, we were running at 102% of where we were in 2019. So we're actually higher than we were in 2019, and accelerating rapidly, it has to be said. So quite a good news story there. And just in terms of the operational efficiencies, freight trains have been arriving 2 hours early by not having to stand in passing loops. and we were able to extend some of the really key long distance consumer goods services from Daventry in the Midlands up to Scotland. We have 6 of those in each direction every day now. There are just a few feet short of a half a mile long now. So that's a really big train, certainly by British standards, not much by US standards, but by British standards, that's pretty good. And that's 40 lorries of over 40 lorries actually off the M6 and the M74, each and every one of those trains that moves. So there's a lot more to be done, and I think none of us would have wished COVID to have happened, but certainly the freight sector is emerging from it in quite a good place really, and we just need to drive that forward now. There are all sorts of issues about how we best use capacity on the railway. We can get a lot more out of the current system by better signalling and great separation of junctions, because it's the junctions that, generally speaking, congest the railway system, just like Ivan's motorway junctions. If you grade separate them, you get an awful lot more through the same piece of land. So there's much more we can do, but there are then also some really interesting debates about what's the value of a pass. Clearly, if you have a peak hour passenger service, that's worth a heck of a lot to UK PLC, as is a long distance intercity service. But at the margin, where you have a choice between a long freight train carrying anything between 50 and 80 lorries worth of traffic, or do you run a short middle day off-peak passenger service, perhaps reducing the frequency from perhaps every quarter of an hour to every half an hour or something like that, what's the best use of the scarce resource called capacity for UK PLC? And those issues are currently being addressed through all sorts of interesting studies that are coming through. I think at that margin, I think there probably is a reasonable case for some slight reduction in passenger frequencies to create more capacity for freight, if that's necessary, if we in advance of investment in infrastructure capacity enhancement.
Great, thanks, Julian. And I think actually that answers a question a few people have picked up in the chat, which is about balancing freight and passenger on the railway. And nice to have a pandemic and a transport good news story. I know the active travel has been quite a good news story in the transport sector from the pandemic, but I didn't realise freight is actually a good news story as well. Lynn, you've got your hand up.
Well, just a very quick one, Stephen, which is to say that. There are, as you say, there aren't very many good news stories out of the pandemic, but I do think that the experience that people have had, particularly in the first lockdown, of the air being clean and streets being good for walking and cycling is possibly quite profound. And as we emerge from COVID, as we hopefully will, I think that the possibility that people might kind of hold on to that and say, yes, that kind of future is something that we want to have, would be a very, very positive thing. And I think the other thing that is that as this kind of Zoom event shows, what we've all learned about how you can achieve things without traveling by remote working and by using technology, again, I think is profound. Some work that we're involved in with ARUP actually for Welsh Government is just looking at the potential for remote working, and around about 40% of the workforce could work from home 2 to 3 days a week or work from a remote working hub for some of that time. And so there's enormous potential there. Now, not everybody is in a good position to work from their bedrooms, particularly younger people. But if we were to look at investing in remote working hubs that are in suburban town centres and town centres close to excellent public transport, that also offers some opportunities to reduce rush hour travel on the strategic road network and on the general road network. And I think there's a whole series of things like that we could learn from the pandemic and sort of take forward into the sort of post-pandemic future.
Thanks, Lynn. Well, that's hands going up. Let me go to Ivan first, Julian, then I'll come to you.
Yeah, I think we have to recognise that a large part of the economy actually isn't office-based. It's real-world manufacturing. It's movement of goods. So we can't all work from our homes. I think we have to make that mental leap to what does a post-carbon economy look like? How will it work? And for me, I think it's fairly clear that we will need various forms of transport to support that post-carbon economy. And one of them will be a flexible, resilient, strategic road network providing inter-urban travel. and to get to that network that is operates in a net zero carbon way will require investment.
Thanks, Ivan. And Julian.
Yeah, thanks, Stephen. We've had quite a few questions in the chat about, so if we're all going to work from home, do we still need HS2? I paraphrase, but that's the gist of it. The answer is categorically yes, because without HS2, there will simply not be enough freight paths on the West Coast main line to decarbonise and mode shift off the M1 and the M6. It's just that simple. And by the way, the same applies to phase 2B in terms of getting lorries off the, getting more capacity on Midland Main Line and East Coast Main Line as well. One point that I'm sure will come up here is, but surely the environmental impact of HS2 is completely contrary to what we're trying to do here. No. One of my colleagues has texted me whilst we've been speaking, actually, to say that he's worked out that the HS2's carbon footprint, and that's both the construction and operation of phase 1 over a 120-year period, is less than the UK road network emits in 1 month. So in terms of decarbonisation, HS2 is actually still a very, very good option going forward strategically. And that's not to say that the emissions of the road network are bad, but it is to put in context the fact that both economically and environmentally, HS2 was and remains a very, very sound investment for the UK.
I think the only other thing I'd add to that as well, Julian, is I've seen a question in the chat that says, should we focus on investing in electrifying the rail network as opposed to doing HS2? I think my response to that, and I've had this question asked before, is we absolutely need to do both of those things. Yeah. We can't do just HS2 or just invest in the existing rail network. It's about utilising those two opportunities together, and we do need to focus on and deliver improvements in the existing network and delivering electrification to support existing services, and as Julian's touched on there, the freight stuff as well. And I think that's a really, really important point to stress, is it's not an either or, it's both, definitely.
Thanks, Stephen. Ivan, I think you had your hand up.
Yeah, I was just reflecting on how we think about carbon, and I think it's important to separate out carbon from construction and recognizing the challenge of how do we decarbonize steel, how do we decarbonize concrete, from carbon from operation and use. And clearly, transport infrastructure like HS2, it will be electric. And if that electric is generated with zero carbon, it isn't at the moment, but at some point in the future we will get there, then infrastructure that uses electricity will be able to say we operate with zero carbon emissions. Actually, the road network will be able to say that as well at some point, albeit there are emissions of other sorts and other environmental impacts that indeed all forms of transport share.
Thanks, Ivan. And we've only got a few minutes to go. We need to finish by 2 o'clock. But perhaps if I can take chair's prerogative here, and perhaps for a final round of the panel, to ask about, we've got a lot of transport professionals listening into this, and I think often the challenge is a lot of these things are sort of, the government needs to do this and the government needs to do that. And I think it's always useful to understand, what can transport professionals do to address decarbonisation? They go to work tomorrow, they go back to their desk now, they go back to work tomorrow. What can we be doing, day to day that would make a difference in your opinion, for roads and rail? Anyone want to start with that? Lynn?
My experience of transport professionals is that because transport professionals are thinking about this whole set of issues day in, day out, they are way more informed than most politicians and way more informed than the population at large. And I think that transport professionals have a really crucial leadership role in informing ourselves, and having informed ourselves, then making sure that we articulate what we know in the discussions that we have with clients, with local authorities, with governments. This is quite complex and it's quite a technical issue. And understanding the Committee on Climate Change's 6th carbon budget, as Lisa and I know right at the moment from some work we're doing right now, is incredibly hard work. But nobody, apart from transport professionals, is going to get to grips with this in the kind of depth and detail that we can. And so I think that all of us, and probably everybody who's watching this being broadcast, have an absolutely central role in leading and showing others that there are solutions, there are things that we can do, and being honest about the imperative for action and the recognition that it is an emergency. It's just like COVID, it's just that it's in slow motion. And showing that leadership is totally crucial.
That's a great answer. Thanks very much, Lynn. Ivan, did you have a hand up?
I absolutely endorse what Lynn has just said. Clearly, transport professionals have a lot of priorities. There's asset management, health and safety, engineering expertise, but actually carbon needs to be going up their agenda in the everyday decision making they do in their work. And actually there needs to be a sense of being energized and action orientated around the things we need to do to get to that zero carbon future.
Great, thank you. Julian, then Stephen.
Yeah, fully support that. My plea, of course, would be, please remember freight in everything you're doing in transport planning. It is so often forgotten. You know, the number of transport plans I see, which are not transport plans, they're passenger transport plans. So please don't forget freight. You know, it is, as we've said, fundamental in decarbonisation. I think we need to do a lot more across all the institutions, actually. I think we need to do between highways engineers, transport planners, transport operators. We all need to up our game in terms of understanding of decarbonisation and the options available to us, so we can talk in a very informed manner, not just through official channels to government and people like that, but simply to inform everybody else in the community, because the level of I'll say it, ignorance about decarbonisation is huge. It's getting a bit better, but it's still huge. And if we had more time, we could talk about hydrogen and what a no, I won't go there. But we could talk about it and discuss the pros and cons of the various alternative fuels. Thanks.
Thanks, Julian. Good points. Stephen.
Yeah, I think for me, I briefly touched on this in my presentation, and I mentioned best for carbon decisions a few times as I went through as well. But I think the key thing that I would stress and emphasise is that transport is a system, it's not a competition. We don't need to be competing between road and rail and flying and cycling and walking. They're all modes of transport and they're all essential. They're just essential for different things, and we need to make sure that whatever the solutions we deploy and whatever solutions get built or get constructed or play a part in moving people and goods from one place to another, we're picking the right modes of transport for the right movements of goods. And that in itself will save so much carbon, even in today's situation. But if we focus on that and encourage that as we go forward into the future as well, that will be a massive stepping stone in supporting sort of the whole transport sector from decarbonising. So I think that's the one thing that I would say to keep in the front of your mind, is that it's not a competition. It's about making sure that we're using the right modes for the right movements.
Thanks, Stephen. And Lisa, about 1 minute for a final comment from you.
Sorry, very quickly. Yeah, professionals, most of the professionals actually know what they need to do. I think it's just the lack of political will and support. However, we have published a report, you know, showing what local authorities can do now, even with their, you know, limited powers and funding. You know, there are resources at their fingertips if they choose to use them. But it does help, obviously, if you've got political leadership in your authority.
Thanks, Lisa. So we're going to have to finish there. I'll try to get through as many of the questions you put as possible. So thank you very much to everybody for posting questions. We've tried to pick on some of the themes. Sorry if I didn't get to all of the questions. But I think it's been a fantastic debate. We've learned a lot about the challenges and opportunities in decarbonising the transport system. And I think those final answers were great advice to people working in the sector on how to take leadership and develop your understanding in around carbon in your day-to-day work. So I'd like to close by thanking CILT and PTRC and the Transport Planning Society for supporting the event, particularly to Brogan for organising everything for us. I'd like to thank the speakers for giving up their valuable time today to share thoughts and insight and expertise. Lynn Sloman and Lisa Hopkinson of Transport for Quality of Life, Stephen Hart from Network Rail, Ivan Lefebvre from Highways England, and Julian Worth from CILT Rail Freight Forum. Thank you very much. Thanks to everybody for joining us today. Hope you found it engaging. Please look out for more events coming up, and keep up the good work in decarbonising transport. Thanks very much. Bye.
Thanks all. Bye.